The bullet that grazed Rosa Chandler's shoulder on the afternoon of April the 3rd, 1878, was not what changed her life. It was the man who pulled her out of the street afterward, pressed his bandana against the wound, and looked at her like she was the most remarkable thing he had ever laid eyes on, when she knew, down to the marrow of her bones, that she was not. Tascosa, Texas was not a gentle town. It sat on the Canadian River like a rough stone in a boot, full of cattlemen and drifters, and the occasional outlaw who wandered through on his way to somewhere worse. The Panhandle wind never quit, the dust never settled, and the law was a thin and unreliable thing that changed shape depending on who had the loudest gun on any given afternoon. Rosa had lived there for 3 years by that April, having come from San Antonio after her mother passed, following the only opportunity she could find: a position as the cook and bookkeeper at the Gilded Spur Saloon, owned by a stout, red-faced man named Harold Briggs, who paid fairly and asked nothing improper, which made him considerably better than most employers a woman alone could hope to find in the Texas Panhandle in 1878. She was 24 years old. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of dark brown hair wound into a practical knot, a calico dress that was clean but not pretty, ink stains on her right forefinger from tallying figures in the ledger, and the kind of face that people described, when they described it at all, as pleasant. She had never believed herself to be more than that. She had watched women walk into Tascosa who stopped the room, women with laughter like music and eyes that could flatten a man at 20 paces, and she understood with calm clarity that she was not among their number. She was useful, she was competent, she was steady, and she was plain, and she had made her peace with both. She had not, however, made her peace with being shot at. The trouble started because of Frank Deacon, as trouble in Tascosa so frequently did. Deacon was a cattle broker with a temper that ran hotter than August asphalt, and a quarrel with a rancher named Emmett Voss that had been simmering for the better part of a winter. The quarrel had something to do with a disputed land boundary and a missing herd of 60 cattle, and it had reached its boiling point on that Thursday afternoon in April when both men materialized on the main street, with their respective allies flanking them, and their hands hovering near their revolvers. Rosa had been crossing from the dry goods store back to the Gilded Spur with a sack of flour balanced against her hip when the first shot cracked the afternoon air like a whip. She dove to the side. The flour hit the ground and burst into a white cloud. She felt the burn across her left shoulder before she fully understood what had happened: a stray round, not aimed at her, just carelessly loose in the chaos of men shouting and drawing, and the thunder of horses bolting from their hitches. She pressed herself against the side of the barber shop, breathing hard, her hand going to the shoulder where the heat was building into something sharper and more insistent. The gunfight resolved itself in under 2 minutes, as most of them did. One of Deacon's men took a wound to the thigh and went down loudly. Voss's side retreated toward the livery. Deacon himself fired twice more, and then stood in the middle of the street looking satisfied with himself in the way that petty, dangerous men so often did after minor victories. The whole affair was already dissolving into the ordinary chaos of aftermath: shouting, the moaning of the injured man, a woman screaming from the direction of the milliner's shop, when Rosa felt a strong hand close around her uninjured arm and someone crouched beside her. "Let me see," said a voice, calm and low, with the particular steadiness of a person who had been in worse situations and come out the other side. She turned. The man beside her was perhaps 28 or 29, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was handsome the way mountains were handsome, not prettily, but with a kind of durability that made you keep looking. He had dark reddish-brown hair beneath a battered hat, and his eyes were the gray-green of the river after a storm, and he was already pressing a bandana, folded into a tight square, against her shoulder with practiced efficiency. "I am fine," she said, because it was what she always said. "You have been grazed," he told her, not unkindly. "It is not deep, but it needs to be cleaned and wrapped before the dust gets into it, or you will spend a week wishing you had let someone help you." She looked at him more carefully. He wore a star on his coat, a marshal's badge, the silver dulled with use but polished enough that it caught the light. He was not Tascosa's regular town marshal, who was a lanky man named Pickford with a ginger mustache. This was someone else, and the badge said something she could not read at this distance through the blur of adrenaline. "You are not Marshal Pickford," she said. "No, ma'am." "Roy Rourke, I'm a deputy marshal out of the federal office in Mobedy. I came through on business regarding the Voss situation." He pressed more firmly on her shoulder and she hissed through her teeth. "Sorry, the bleeding needs to stop first before the apologies." "I did not ask for an apology." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but a near thing. "No, you did not." He held the pressure steady and looked at her with those river-colored eyes. "What is your name?" "Rosa Chandler." "I work at the Gilded Spur, Miss Chandler. I am going to walk you to the doctor's office on the far end of Main Street, and we are going to get this taken care of. And then you are going to sit down and drink whatever terrible coffee Doc Haynes keeps on his stove, and that is going to be the end of your involvement in Frank Deacon's business." "Is that agreeable?" she wanted to argue. She was not, by nature, a woman who liked being guided or managed. But the shoulder was beginning to truly hurt, and there was something in Roy Rourke's manner that was direct without being condescending, efficient without being cold, and so she found herself saying, "That is agreeable," and letting him help her to her feet. He kept the bandana pressed to her shoulder with one hand and did not hover or fuss, did not treat her like something fragile. He simply walked beside her through the thinning chaos of the aftermath, and when a drunk man stumbled into their path, he moved the man aside with the kind of quiet authority that required no raised voice, and they continued on. Doc Haynes was a spare, serious man of 60 who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. He cleaned the wound, confirmed it was a graze and nothing more, wound it in clean linen, and told Rosa to keep it dry and change the bandage daily. Roy Rourke waited in the outer room. She could hear him speaking to someone, likely Haynes's wife, who always seemed to be present despite no one ever seeing her arrive or leave, and his voice had the same unhurried quality in conversation that it had in crisis, like a man who had decided at some point that panic was simply not worth the energy. When she came out with her shoulder wrapped and her arm in a sling, she found him standing by the window looking out at the street with his hat in his hands. He turned when she appeared. "Better?" he asked. "Better," she confirmed. "Thank you, Deputy Rourke. You did not have to do that. A woman has been shot, even grazed, in a street where federal business is being conducted. I believe that falls squarely within the category of things I am required to do." He paused. "Beyond the requirement, I am glad you are all right." She studied him for a moment. There was something sincere in the plainness of his statement that she was not accustomed to. Men in Tascosa, in her experience, said things to women with a degree of performance attached, even the decent ones. Roy Rourke sounded like someone reading an accurate account of his own feelings. "I have to get back to the saloon," she said. "Harold will wonder where I am." "Of course." He stepped back to give her room. "Miss Chandler, I will be in town for several days while I deal with the Deacon matter. If there is anything you need, if the wound gives you trouble or anyone bothers you, the marshal's office on 2nd Street knows how to find me." "I do not anticipate being troubled," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No, I imagine you handle most things before anyone else thinks to worry about them." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, only nodded and walked back out into the Tascosa afternoon with her flower gone, her shoulder burning, and the peculiar sensation of being seen by someone who, by all rights, should not have been able to see anything about her at all. She thought about it for the rest of the evening, between ladling stew and tallying the week's accounts for Harold. She thought about it while she lay in her small room behind the saloon kitchen, listening to the wind come off the Canadian River and rattle the window in its frame. She told herself it was the shock of being shot at, nothing more. Adrenaline made everything feel larger and more significant than it was. She believed this almost completely, right up until the moment Roy Rourke walked into the Gilded Spur the next morning and asked if the stove was available and whether she had changed her bandage yet. She had. She told him so. He ordered coffee and sat at the end of the bar, the only customer at that early hour, and she poured for him and found herself, against her better judgment, staying to talk. He asked about the saloon, about Harold Briggs, about the general landscape of Tascosa's disputes and hierarchies, and she realized after a while that he was not making idle conversation. He was doing his job, gathering information about Deacon and Voss with the patient thoroughness of a man who knew how to listen. But he also asked about her, how long she had been in Tascosa, where she had come from, what she thought about the land out here in the Panhandle, this wide, flat world under an enormous sky. And those questions were not about Deacon or Voss. Those questions were about Rosa Chandler, and she could not think of the last time someone had asked specifically about her. "You do the books here," he said, nodding at the ledger she had been working on before he arrived. "I cook and I keep accounts. Harold is a good employer. He is fair. That is a rarer thing than it should be." Roy Rourke wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at her with that calm, direct attention that had already become, in the space of one day, familiar. "You went to school?" "Yes, in San Antonio. My mother believed in education fiercely." She paused. "She was a school teacher. You take after her." Something about the simplicity of the question caught in her chest. "I hope so. She was one of the best people I have ever known. She passed 3 years ago, consumption." He was quiet for a moment, and it was the right kind of quiet, not the uncomfortable silence of someone who does not know what to do with grief, but the deliberate silence of someone who is giving it room. "I am sorry," he said finally. "It is how I ended up here," Rosa said. "She died and the house had to be sold and I needed work. A woman alone has a limited number of good options." She said it matter-of-factly, because it was a matter of fact. "Harold was advertising through the district and his terms were fair and legal, and so here I am." "Here you are," Roy Rourke said, and looked at her like she was something remarkable that had arrived by an unlikely route. She felt color rise in her face and turned to refill his coffee, even though it was still mostly full. He came back the following morning, and the one after that. The Deacon matter stretched across the week in the way that legal business in the Texas Panhandle tended to do, slowly, with considerable arguing and not a great deal of resolution. And Roy Rourke moved through Tascosa with his quiet authority and his unhurried manner, building the case for the federal office against Deacon's cattle fraud, which was the real issue beneath the quarrel with Voss. He spent his days in the marshal's office and out on the range. He spent his mornings at the Gilded Spur's kitchen end of the bar, drinking Rosa's coffee. By the 4th day she was making the coffee stronger because she had noticed he liked it that way. By the 5th day she was setting out a plate of biscuits without being asked, because he missed breakfast on the days he rode out early and she had observed this. By the 6th day they were talking with the ease of people who have known each other longer than they have, and she could not quite account for how that had happened. He told her about himself in the same direct way he did everything. He had grown up in Missouri, the younger of 2 brothers. His father had been a farmer and his older brother still was. He had come west after the war. He'd been 17 at the end of it, too young for most of the fighting, but old enough to know the world was wider than his father's fields, and had spent several years working cattle drives before taking a position as a deputy sheriff in Indian Territory, which had led eventually to the federal marshal's service. He had been with the marshal's office for 4 years. He had no permanent town, only a circuit of cases. He lived, he said without bitterness, mostly out of a saddlebag. "That sounds lonely," Rosa said on the morning of the 6th day before she had thought to guard the observation. He considered this honestly. "It can be," he said. "There are things about it that suit me well, the moving, the different country, but yes, there are times when it is lonely." She looked down at her own hands, the ink stain on her forefinger, the practical calluses from years of cooking and cleaning. "I know something about that," she said quietly, and did not elaborate, and he did not push her. On the seventh day he said, "Miss Chandler, would you walk with me this evening? Along the river if your shoulder is healed enough. It is a pleasant hour around sunset." She held very still for a moment. "I am not very good company for walking," she said. "I tend not to make conversation for its own sake." "Neither do I," said Roy Rourke. "I thought that might be exactly why it would work." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, sudden and genuine, and the surprise was at herself, that she still had the capacity for it. "All right," she said. "This evening." The Canadian River at sunset in April was something that made you understand why people came out to this flat, difficult country and stayed. The sky turned colors that had no proper names in English, layers of orange and rose, and a deep bruised violet at the horizon, and the river caught it all and held it in trembling reflection. They walked along the bank without speaking very much, and Rosa found that he had been right. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill space. At one point he said, "You never told me how you feel about being here. Tascosa, I mean, the Panhandle." She thought about it honestly, as he seemed to prefer. "I do not love it the way some people do," she said. "I love what I can make here, the work, the order of the books, the routine of the kitchen. I love that I am capable of managing my own situation. But the land itself," she looked out at the flat, enormous country stretching away in every direction. "It is beautiful in a way that is a little frightening. Too much sky, too much of everything." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." He paused. "Where would you choose to be if you had the choosing?" No one had asked her that before, not in 3 years. "Somewhere with trees," she said at last. "And a house with a proper kitchen, not a saloon stove, and a garden for vegetables, nothing grand. Something manageable and mine." The last word came out with more feeling than she had intended. She felt the exposure of it and looked away at the river. "That sounds like everything worth having," Roy Rourke said, and she turned back to look at him and found him watching her with that steady, grave attention, and something shifted between them in the evening air, subtle and irreversible, the way a hinge turns and cannot turn back. She told herself, walking back to the saloon in the long dusk, that it was nothing. That he was a passing figure in a town full of passing figures. That his business in Tascosa would conclude, and he would follow his circuit to wherever it led next. And that she would be here with her ledger and her stove and her practical calico dress and her pleasant, ordinary face. And that was the appropriate and realistic outcome. She told herself this with great conviction, and went to sleep and dreamed about river-colored eyes and a voice that was always, always calm. Roy Rourke's business in Tascosa did conclude more or less. Frank Deacon was served with a federal warrant for cattle fraud and removed to Mobity to stand trial, which satisfied the legal aspects of the situation, even if it left Emmett Voss and his dispute about the land boundary unresolved, in the way that many land boundary disputes remained in the Texas Panhandle, where the surveyor's records were inconsistent, and the laws changed depending on which set of lawyers one consulted. Roy spent 2 more days filing the remaining paperwork and handing his findings to Marshal Pickford, who was grateful for the federal intervention, and then he came to the Gilded Spur on a Tuesday morning and sat at the end of the bar and looked at his coffee mug for a long time without drinking. Rosa watched him from the corner of her eye while she worked the stove. She had learned his silences by now. This was not the comfortable, thoughtful silence. This was a man working towards saying something and not quite finding the approach. She let him find it. "I have to ride to Mobity on Thursday," he said at last. "The trial will likely last 2 weeks, and after that I have an assignment in Palo Duro country." "I know," she said steadily. She had known since the warrant was served. He turned the mug in his hands. "Miss Chandler, Rosa, I want to say something, and I am aware it may be too forward given the short time we have had." She put down the ladle she was holding and turned to face him properly. She believed in facing things properly. "Say it then," she said. He looked at her directly, as he always did. "I do not want to leave without telling you that these mornings, this week, your company, it has mattered to me more than I know how to put in a polished way. You are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, and I am not saying that as flattery. I am saying it because it is the truest thing I can say." The compliment landed in an unusual place in her chest, and her first instinct was to deflect it, which was always her first instinct. "Deputy Rourke," she said, "I am a cook and a bookkeeper. I live in a back room of a saloon, and my most recent adventure was being accidentally shot during someone else's argument. I am not sure interesting is the correct word. Then I am using it incorrectly," he said, "because you are." She shook her head slowly. "I am ordinary," she said. The word was familiar in her mouth. It was the word she had always used for herself, and she meant it without self-pity, only accuracy. "Genuinely, truly ordinary. And you have been in difficult country for a long time, and I think perhaps a week of ordinary seems more appealing than it actually is when you have been living out of a saddlebag." Roy Rourke was quiet for a moment after that. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and something moved through his expression, something deeper than anything that had come before, something that arrived from a long distance, as though this moment were the destination of a journey he had not known he was making. "Rosa," he said quietly. "Then I have spent my life looking for ordinary." She did not breathe. The saloon was empty of customers, and the stove ticked, and the Panhandle wind moved the window on its hinges, and those words hung in the air of the room and did not dissipate. "You are someone who does her work without show," he continued, his voice low and steady. "Who keeps her word and keeps her accounts and keeps her chin up in a town that would knock most people flat. Who knows how to be quiet and when to be quiet and what the silence is worth. Who makes coffee the right strength after 4 days of observation and does not think anything of it. Who tells me I am probably just tired when I say I find her remarkable, because it would not occur to her that she might actually be remarkable." He stopped. "I am not a man who has wanted to stay anywhere for 10 years. Standing here right now, I cannot think of a single place I would rather be than Tascosa, Texas." Rosa Chandler, who had grown up being the reliable one and the steady one, and the one who managed everything without making a fuss, felt something she had not permitted herself to feel for a very long time. She felt it tentatively, carefully, the way you test ice before you walk on it. And then she felt it more fully, and her carefully maintained equilibrium wobbled, and she said, "You have an assignment in Palo Duro after Mobedy." "Yes." "Then you will not be here." "No," he held her gaze, "but Mobedy is not far, and Palo Duro is not the moon, and there is no rule in the federal marshal's service that says a man cannot write letters if he has someone worth writing to." "You want to write letters," she said. "I want to write letters. I want to come back when I can. I want to know you better, Rosa Chandler, in whatever form that can take given where we both are." He paused. "If that is agreeable." The word agreeable was the same word he had used that first afternoon in the street, pressing his bandana to her shoulder, asking if she would let him help. She wondered if he remembered that. She suspected he did. "That is agreeable," she said, and the small smile she gave him was perhaps not the most composed thing she had ever produced, but it was entirely real. He left on Thursday morning as he had said he would, and Rosa stood outside the Gilded Spur and watched his horse carry him south toward Mobedy. And then she went back inside and tallied the accounts and made breakfast for Harold, and did not allow herself to be sentimental about it, which lasted right up until Friday afternoon when his first letter arrived, having apparently been written the evening before he left, and given to the postal rider who passed through on the Mobedy route. It was not a flowery letter. That would have been wrong for him. It was direct and observational, describing the country between Tascosa and Mobedy with the same precision he brought to everything, and then at the end it said simply, "I am finding that ordinary coffee on a saloon stove tastes considerably less right than it should. I hope you are well. Roy." She read it 4 times and then put it under her pillow and was not the least embarrassed about it. He wrote twice a week. She wrote back. Her letters were more careful at first, information about the town, about Harold's business, about a particularly interesting discrepancy she had found in the month's accounts that turned out to be a bartender skimming small amounts over 3 months, which she corrected without drama and reported to Harold, who discharged the man quietly. Roy wrote back about that with obvious appreciation. "You handled that better than most law officers would have." She saved his letters in a tin box that had once held hard candies and was now more valuable than anything else she owned. The Deacon trial lasted nearly a month, not 2 weeks, because federal trials in 1878 Texas had a way of expanding to fill the time available. Roy's letters from Mobedy were drier in tone. He found courthouse procedure tedious compared to field work, but they contained small observations about people and moments that made her laugh, and she found herself laughing more than she had in years. He described the judge as a man who appeared to have been assembled from old furniture. He described the defense attorney as someone who confused the length of a speech with the quality of an argument. He described a cat that had taken up residence in the marshal's office and whose opinion of the entire proceedings was, Roy wrote, clearly and correctly negative. She wrote back about a minister who had come through Tascosa attempting to reform the moral character of the town, and had made the mistake of delivering his reform speech to the assembled drinkers of the Gilded Spur on a Saturday evening. She wrote about a pair of cowboys from one of the nearby ranches who had gotten into a violent argument over a card game that turned out to hinge on a misunderstanding about the rules of poker so fundamental that neither of them had actually been playing the same game. She wrote about the way the Panhandle looked after rain, how the flat country turned briefly green and the air smelled clean for a day before the dust came back. He wrote, "When you describe the Panhandle after rain, I can smell it through the page. I did not know a person could do that with words. I thought you said you were ordinary." She sat with that letter for a long time. Roy returned to Tascosa 6 weeks after leaving, in the middle of May, when the Panhandle sun had properly arrived, and the days were long and hot and golden. He came in the early morning, and Rosa was at the stove when she heard his boots on the floorboards. She had learned the rhythm of them, and she turned before she heard his voice. He looked road-worn and tired, and she could see the Palo Duro assignment already in his eyes, the next obligation waiting for him. But he was here now, and when he sat down at the end of the bar and she set coffee in front of him without being asked, the expression on his face was one she stored away carefully in the same inner place she kept the letters. "The trial is finished," he said. "Deacon is going to spend 3 years in the federal penitentiary." The cattle fraud was broader than we thought. He had been at it for nearly a decade. "I am glad," she said. "The men whose cattle he took will have some justice at least. Some." He said it with the practical acceptance of someone who knew that justice in the Texas Panhandle was rarely complete. "The Palo Duro situation needs my attention starting next Monday. I have 4 days. 4 days, she said. He looked at her steadily. "I want to spend at least some portion of them talking to you, if you will allow it." "I will allow a great deal of it," she said, and did not look away, and the color that rose in his face was satisfying in a way she had not expected. Those 4 days in May were different from the first week in April. The first week had been the careful circling of 2 people who did not yet know what they were to each other, feeling for solid ground. These 4 days were different in the way that a road feels different once you know where it goes. They walked along the river in the evenings. They sat in the kitchen when the saloon was quiet in the afternoon, and talked for hours about nothing that mattered and everything that did. He helped her carry a barrel of flour from the dry goods store, because he was there, and it was heavy, and he did not make a thing of it. She showed him the ledger and explained the system she had developed for tracking credit accounts, and he studied it with genuine interest and said it was the clearest accounting system he had ever seen. On the second evening, walking by the river, she told him about her father, who she had never mentioned before, a topic she kept carefully set aside. Her father had left San Antonio when she was 7, on a business trip to Dallas that he never returned from, and her mother had said only that he had chosen a different life and they were going to be fine. They had been fine. Her mother had been extraordinary at making fine out of very little. But the space where her father had been was still there, and she told Roy about it with the matter-of-fact composure she brought to everything that hurt. He listened without interrupting and without offering easy consolation, which was the exactly right response. When she finished, he said, "Your mother was right that you would be fine, and she was right to believe it because you are. But I think you have been fine so long on your own that the idea of not having to be, the idea of someone else holding up part of the weight seems suspicious." She stopped walking. They were at the bend in the river where the cottonwoods grew thick and their roots trailed in the water. The evening light was doing its usual extraordinary business above them. "That is a perceptive thing to say," she said carefully. "I have been paying attention," he said simply, "for 6 weeks through letters and 4 days in April." Yes, he was not apologetic about it. Some things do not take as long as you would expect them to. Roy, his name, the first time she had used it without the title, it felt significant and she knew he heard it that way. Rosa. "I do not know how to do this," she said honestly. "Any of this. I am a cook and a bookkeeper who has spent 3 years being reliably self-sufficient. I do not have experience with being cared for. I'm not sure I know how to allow it." "I know," he said. "I have noticed." There was no impatience in his voice. "I'm not asking you to do it all at once. I'm just asking you to keep letting me write letters and keep writing back and see where that goes." "And where do you think it goes?" she asked. She was not being coy. She genuinely wanted to know his answer because he was a direct man and his direct answers had so far been worth hearing. He thought about it honestly, the way she liked. "I think," he said, "that it goes towards something I have not had before and have wanted without knowing what to call it. Something that feels like," he paused, searching for the word, "landing. After a very long time of moving." She looked at him in the cottonwood light and felt the ice hold her weight and let herself stand on it. "That is a good answer," she said softly. He smiled, a full smile this time, not the near thing, and it changed his face considerably, and she filed this away too, this collection of things she was keeping. She thought she could keep adding to it for a very long time and not run out of room. He left for Palo Duro on the Monday morning as he had said he would. He kissed her hand when he left, formal and deliberate, like a man who means the gesture and does not want it to be mistaken for anything less than what it is. She stood on the step of the gilded spur and watched him go south in the long morning light, and this time the watching was different from the first time. This time there was weight attached to it, the good solid weight of something real. The letters continued. Through May and June and into the long blazing heat of July, the letters traveled back and forth across the Texas Panhandle on postal riders and passing travelers, and once, memorably, delivered by a Comanchero trader who had no idea what he was carrying but had been paid to carry it and had done so with impressive reliability. Roy's Palo Duro assignment was complicated, a cattle-rustling operation with roots that went deeper than anticipated, touching ranch foremen and buyers and a crooked land agent, and his letters sometimes showed the strain of it, the particular exhaustion of work that required patience when your instinct was to act. But he never stopped writing. Twice a week, without fail, the way he did everything. Rosa kept the accounts and managed the kitchen and expanded the saloon's menu at Harold's request, because word had gotten out that the food at the Gilded Spur was better than anything else available in Tascosa, which was true, and which brought in a better class of customer and increased the revenue by a margin that delighted Harold considerably. She took some satisfaction in this. She was good at what she did and she knew it, and in a life that had been largely about managing alone, she had learned to take her satisfaction where it was honestly earned. But the letters had changed something. They had opened a space in her that had been, not closed exactly, but carefully unfurnished. The way you leave a room empty not because you dislike rooms but because you have not yet found what to put in it. And now the room was filling up, one letter at a time, with the weight and texture of Roy Rourke's steady, honest presence in her life. She wrote him about things she had not told anyone, about her mother's laugh and the particular way she had of making even bad news sound manageable, about her ambitions. The word felt strange even in writing for a future that was more than a back room and a saloon stove. She wrote about reading, about the books she borrowed from the schoolhouse on the edge of town and returned carefully. She wrote about watching a hawk hunt above the Panhandle flats one afternoon from the back door of the saloon, and how it reminded her of the feeling of being very capable at something, the pure purposeful focus of it. He wrote back, "I have thought often about what you said regarding the hawk. I think you are more like that hawk than you will admit. You make it look like the ordinary operation of daily competence, but there is nothing ordinary about what you do with it." She wrote back, "You are still misusing the word ordinary." He wrote, "I know exactly what I am doing with it." She kept that letter in the tin box with particular care. Roy returned to Tascosa in late August, thin and tired from the palo duro work and tanner than before, and he walked into the Gilded Spur on a Wednesday evening when the place was busy with the end-of-week crowd from the surrounding ranches. Rosa was behind the kitchen partition, managing 3 pots and a pan of cornbread, when she heard Harold's voice saying, "Deputy Rourke, as I live and breathe," and then boots on the kitchen floorboards that she knew by sound. She turned, and he was there in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, road dust on him, and looking at her with an expression that had dispensed entirely with the careful reserve he had maintained in April. This was a man who had been writing letters for 4 months and was done with careful. "You look terrible," she said, because it was true and because it was safe ground. "I know," he said. He set his hat on a hook on the doorframe and crossed the kitchen, and she had just enough time to set the ladle down before he was standing in front of her, close in the way he had not been close before, and he said, "Rosa," in a voice that sounded like a man coming home, and she said, "Roy." And then she was in his arms and he was holding her with the same steady firmness he brought to everything, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular relief of not holding everything up alone. He kissed her that evening properly, after the kitchen was cleaned and the saloon had quieted, and they sat on the step outside the back door with the August stars enormous above the Panhandle. He asked first, which was, she had decided, entirely characteristic, and she said yes with more certainty than she had said yes to anything in years, and the kiss was careful and then less careful, and afterward they sat for a long time watching the stars and talking about nothing important and everything that was. Roy had 3 weeks in Tascosa before his next assignment. They spent them building something together in the quiet, practical way of 2 people who are very serious about what they are building. He met Harold Briggs formally, and Harold looked at him with the assessing eye of an employer who feels responsible for the single woman working in his establishment and seemed to find him satisfactory. He met the doctor who had treated Rosa's shoulder, and Doc Haynes said simply, "Good," when Roy explained the situation, with the brevity of a man who has observed that certain people belong together and wants no time wasted getting them there. Roy told her, on a quiet afternoon when the saloon was empty between the lunch crowd and the evening drinkers, that he had been thinking seriously about the shape of his future. He was 30 years old. He had been a federal deputy marshal for 4 years, and he was good at the work and he believed in it. But the circuit life, the moving, the saddlebag existence, had been the right thing for the man he had been, and he was no longer entirely sure it was the right thing for the man he was now. "There is a possibility," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with coffee between them, "of a position as the marshal proper for a fixed district. It does not pay as well as the circuit work initially, but it is settled. It is one place." He paused. "There is a district that includes Tascosa." Rosa set her mug down. You would be applying for a position here, in Tascosa. I have not applied yet. I needed to know how you felt about it. Because the reason I am considering a settled position is not abstract. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man with the river-colored eyes who had walked into her life on a bloody April afternoon, and had not, in 4 months, done a single thing he had not meant to do. I think, she said carefully, that if you are asking whether I want you to stay in Tascosa, the answer to that is yes. But I think you should take the position because it is the right position for you, not only because I am here. It is both, he said. The position is the right one and you are here. Those things can both be true. They can, she agreed. He applied for the position. The federal office took 2 months to finalize the appointment, which was actually quite swift for federal office business in 1878. And during those 2 months, he was in and out of Tascosa on remaining circuit work, and the letters maintained their twice-weekly schedule even when they were barely a day's ride apart, because the letters had become something they both needed independent of distance. The appointment was confirmed in October. Roy Rourke was named marshal of the district that included the northern Panhandle and Tascosa specifically, which meant an office on 2nd Street and a settled salary and a place to come back to every evening. He asked her to marry him on a November afternoon with the Panhandle wind at its most characteristic and the cottonwoods along the river bare of their leaves and the sky that particular cold blue that comes with the last of the year. He did it without ceremony or elaborate preparation, which was exactly right. He asked her simply and directly, and with the full weight of his intention behind every word, standing at the bend in the river where the cottonwood roots trailed in the water. She said yes. She said it the way she had come to do things with Roy, without excessive qualification, without bracing against the fear of it. She said yes and meant it cleanly, the way she tallied an honest account. They were married in Tascosa in December of 1878, in the small white church that had been built 3 years prior by a congregation that was still working out its theology but was very committed to the building itself. The ceremony was performed by a minister who was not the reform-minded man Rosa had written about to Roy. That man had moved on to attempt to reform Mobity, but a quiet, straightforward pastor named Reverend Alderman who did his work without flourishes and had, Roy said approvingly afterward, been exactly the right length. Harold Briggs attended and looked genuinely pleased, which was the expression of a man who is glad his employee is happy and also slightly worried about finding a new cook. Doc Haynes came with his perpetually present wife, whom Rosa finally met properly, and discovered was a woman of 70 with a sharp mind and drier humor than her husband. Marshal Pickford attended and shook Roy's hand at considerable length. A dozen people from the town came because Tascosa was the kind of place where events provided their own entertainment, and a wedding was always welcomed. Rosa wore a dress that was not calico. She had made it herself from a bolt of deep blue wool that she had been saving without quite knowing why, and it had a white collar and proper buttons, and it was not grand, but it was hers. When she came down the center aisle of the small church, she saw Roy's face go through something that was not quite any expression she had seen on him before, something that happened in his eyes first and then in the set of his jaw, and she understood it was because he was moved and managing it in the way that was characteristic of him, inward and steady, and she loved him for it the way she had come to love everything about him, clearly, without sentimentality, with full knowledge. They set up a household in a house on the edge of Tascosa proper, a proper house with a kitchen that had a good stove and a window that looked out over the flat country toward the river. It was not large, 3 rooms and a covered porch, but it was solid and it was theirs, and Rosa put a kitchen garden in behind it as soon as the spring ground would allow, which was March of 1879, and when the first vegetables came up in April, she stood at the back door looking at them with a feeling she had difficulty naming, except that it was close to the feeling of putting down something very heavy after carrying it alone for a very long time. Roy's work as marshal kept him occupied and sometimes absent for days at a time when distant parts of the district required attention, but he was settled in a way he had not been before, and it showed in him, some deep loosening of tension she had not noticed carrying until she saw him without it. He was still the same direct, steady, unhurried man. He still made decisions without drama and kept his word without fanfare. But there was something that had come into his face in the months since December, a quality of ease that had not been there in April, as though the circuit riding had been the frame he lived in without knowing a different frame existed. In June of 1879, Rosa told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, the same way she had always told him things, directly, matter-of-factly, with the full fact stated before she allowed herself to think about how to feel about it. He sat with it for a moment in the particular way he sat with things that mattered, giving the moment its full weight, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her in that steady way of his, and she pressed her face against the front of his shirt and felt the good, solid reality of him, and allowed herself to feel the full scope of the feeling, which was enormous and slightly frightening and entirely welcome. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am better than all right," she said, muffled. "I am scared and happy, and those are turning out to be compatible." His arms tightened around her. "Yes," he said quietly, "they are." Their son was born in February of 1880, in the house on the edge of Tascosa with Doc Haynes in attendance and the Panhandle wind doing its usual business outside. They named him James after Roy's father and William for Rosa's maternal grandfather and called him James. He was a red-faced, loud, thoroughly determined infant who made his opinions known with vigorous clarity from the first moment and showed, from the earliest weeks, the same tenacious persistence that Roy brought to difficult assignments and that Rosa brought to intractable accounts. James Roy Rourke was 6 weeks old when Rosa wrote to a friend in San Antonio, describing the situation, and wrote near the end of the letter, "I used to believe I was ordinary and that this was an accurate and sufficient description. I am no longer sure I understand the word the way I once did." Roy read the letter over her shoulder. She let him read her letters, and he let her read his, which was not a thing either of them had decided deliberately, but had simply happened, the natural extension of sharing everything else. And he said, "I believe I told you at some point that you were misusing that word." She laughed and leaned back against him. The baby asleep in the cradle. Roy had made himself from cedar wood during the long waiting weeks before the birth, and the kitchen warm from the stove, and the garden put to bed for winter outside the window. The years in Tascosa were not without their difficulties, because no years are, and certainly not years spent in the Texas Panhandle in the early 1880s, when the cattle industry was booming and contracting in unpredictable ways, and the range wars between large ranching operations and smaller landholders generated the kind of tension that sometimes resolved itself in gunfire, and sometimes in the courts, and often, frustratingly, in neither. Roy's work as marshal put him at the intersection of these tensions regularly, and there were nights when he came home with the kind of tiredness that was not just physical, the tiredness of a man who has spent the day navigating injustice that the law gives him only partial tools to address. She was good at being there for those evenings. She had learned, in the months of letters and in the years of marriage, that Roy did not need to be fixed on the difficult nights any more than she had needed to be fixed when she had told him about her father. He needed to talk and be heard, or sometimes to sit in silence that was genuinely comfortable, and she knew which was called for usually without having to ask. And when she did not know, she asked directly, because that was how they talked. She told him, on one of those evenings in the autumn of 1881, about something that had been on her mind for some time. She had been thinking about the school situation in Tascosa, which had deteriorated since the previous schoolteacher moved on. The town's children were being poorly served, she said, because the replacement was not skilled and left after 3 months, and no one had found another solution. She had been tutoring 2 of the neighboring children informally for several months without mentioning it to Roy because she had not been sure what she was building toward. "I think I should open a school," she said. "A proper one. Not in the schoolhouse. That building needs repairs no one is willing to fund. But here, we have the spare room and it is large enough for 8 or 10 children at once. I have my mother's teaching materials still. I brought them from San Antonio. I have been teaching children informally for 3 months, and I know it is what I want to do." Roy listened to all of this with his complete attention. When she finished, he said, "You have been teaching children for 3 months without telling me. I was not sure yet. Are you sure now?" "Yes." "Then yes," he said simply. "Absolutely yes." He paused. "You have wanted this since you described your mother." She had not realized until he said it that he was right. "Since before that," she said quietly. "Then yes," he said again. Rosa's school opened in the spare room of the Rourke house on the 1st of November, 1881, with 8 students ranging from age 6 to 14. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a little history, and she ran the school with the same precise, efficient energy she had brought to Harold Briggs's accounts, and the results were visible quickly. Parents told other parents. By the following spring she had 14 students and a waiting list, and the town of Tascosa had begun discussing, formally, the possibility of building a proper schoolhouse that could accommodate the demand Rosa Chandler Rourke had created by simply doing what she was exceptionally good at. Harold Briggs, who had solved his cook problem by bringing in a man from Amarillo and had remained friendly toward Rosa ever since, contributed money toward the schoolhouse fund with the expansive generosity of a man writing a story about himself as a benefactor. He was, whatever his motivations, genuinely useful, and Rosa thanked him with the grace she applied to all things. James, now 2 years old and walking with the determined stride of a person who has places to be, attended school in the sense that he was often in the room while his mother taught, a practice that the other children accepted, and that seemed to accelerate his development considerably, given that he was absorbing the lessons aimed at 6-year-olds before he was 3. In the spring of 1882, Rosa discovered she was expecting again. The second pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others. She was busier, with the school and the house and a toddling James, and the March and April weeks when she was tired in a way that went to the bone were a considerable challenge. Roy was attentive without being suffocating, adjusting the household around her needs with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything. And on the bad days when exhaustion and discomfort combined into something that made her short-tempered and unlike herself, he absorbed it without complaint, and with the occasional dry remark that made her laugh despite everything, which she knew was intentional. Their daughter was born in October of 1882. They named her Clara Louisa Clara for no particular reason, except that it was a good name that suited her, and Louisa for Rosa's mother. Clara was, from the beginning, a different kind of person than her brother, quieter, watchful, with enormous dark eyes that took in everything and a thoughtful quality that felt, right from the beginning, like her grandmother's legacy showing through. James received his sister with the serious interest of a 2-year-old encountering a puzzling new development. He examined her from a careful distance for approximately 3 days, and then appointed himself her protector with a seriousness of purpose that did not waver. Roy, watching this, said that James had apparently decided to be a marshal. Rosa said James had apparently decided to be his father. The schoolhouse in Tascosa was completed in the spring of 1883, funded by the community and Harold Briggs's contribution and a modest grant from the county. It was a proper building, whitewashed boards, 6 windows, 2 outhouses, enough benches and desks for 20 students. The school board, which was a newly constituted body featuring Harold Briggs, Doc Haynes, and 3 ranchers, offered Rosa the position of head mistress with a salary attached. she accepted. It was the first time in her life she had been paid for teaching, and it felt, as she told Roy that evening, like the closing of something that had been open for a long time. Like finally arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward since she was 7 years old, watching her mother arrange the schoolroom in San Antonio. "Your mother would have been proud," Roy said. He said it simply, and she knew he meant it, and she let herself feel the full truth of it, the sweet ache of it. "Yes," she said, "she would have been." By 1884, the Rourke household had established the comfortable rhythms of a life that was genuinely lived rather than merely maintained. Roy's work as marshal remained demanding. The Panhandle was not a settled country, and the cattle range debates of the period and the encroachment of barbed wire across traditional open range generated tensions that were ongoing and complex. But he managed his district with the quiet competence that had always characterized his work, and Tascosa had come to think of him as its own in the way that towns adopt the people who serve them well. Rosa's school was the best-regarded institution in the northern Panhandle, and parents drove their children from ranches 20 miles distant to attend. She had hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Alice Pratt, recently arrived from Dallas with a teaching certificate and a determined attitude that Rosa recognized immediately and approved of. And between them, they managed a student body of 22 with a waiting list that would fill the schoolroom twice over if the building could be expanded. James, at 5 years old, was in school with the other children, and was, his mother noted with the combination of pride and exasperation available only to parents, ahead of the curriculum in arithmetic and geography, and below it in patience and sitting still. Clara, at 2, was already attempting to read, having absorbed the sound of letters and phonics from sitting in the schoolroom since before she could walk. Life had textures in it that Rosa had not anticipated when she was a young woman in San Antonio, believing herself to be ordinarily capable of managing alone. The texture of coming home to someone who was genuinely glad to see you, every time. The texture of children's voices in a house that had been built for them, filling the rooms with something that was sometimes exhausting and was always irreplaceable. The texture of lying awake at night beside Roy, in the darkness, talking about things that mattered or not talking at all, and the silence between them as comfortable as conversation. One evening in October of 1884, sitting on their porch in the last of the warm season with the Panhandle stars appearing in their customary extravagance above the flat country, Roy said, "What are you thinking about?" She considered it honestly. "I am thinking about the fact that I am exactly where I want to be," she said, "which is not a thought I have had very often before." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither have I," he said. She leaned into him. They had been sitting side by side in the porch chairs, and she simply leaned, and he put his arm around her in the easy, unhurried way that was entirely characteristic, and they sat watching the stars in the enormous sky. "Roy," she said, "Rosa, I told you once that I was ordinary. Do you remember?" "I do," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have reconsidered my definition." She could feel his smile in the way the arm around her shifted slightly. "Is that so?" "I think ordinary means something different than I believed it did when I was 24 in a back room of a saloon with ink on my fingers." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I confused ordinary with insignificant. I think they are not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment with the proper weight of consideration. "No," he said, "they are not. An ordinary life," she said, "if you live it fully and honestly and with someone who sees you properly, I think that might actually be the extraordinary thing. I think I had it exactly backward." Roy Rourke, who had spent 10 years moving through difficult country looking for something he could not name, and who had found it pressing a bandana against a woman's shoulder on a dusty Texas street in April of 1878, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I told you. I spent my life looking for ordinary. I was right about what it was worth." She laughed softly and tipped her head back to look at the stars. "You were insufferably right about that." "I try," he said gravely, and she laughed again, and the Panhandle night continued its vast and indifferent business above them while they sat in their specific and particular warmth. In 1885, the schoolhouse was expanded with a new room added to the east side, funded partly by the county and partly by a drive among the parents of students, several of whom had personally observed the difference Rosa Rourke's teaching had made in their children. The expansion accommodated 30 students. Alice Pratt, the assistant teacher, had by this point proven herself thoroughly and was offered a position as full teacher of the lower grades, which she accepted and which freed Rosa to spend more time with the upper grades and with the more complex curriculum. Roy's district was restructured in 1885, following changes in the federal marshal's office's jurisdiction, in a way that gave him more authority in the Panhandle proper, and relieved him of some of the further-reaching circuit obligations that had previously required him to ride to the edges of his territory for weeks at a time. The restructuring was an improvement. He was home more consistently. James, 6 years old and deeply interested in horses, began accompanying Roy to the office on Saturdays, where he sat with great seriousness at a corner of the desk and supervised the proceedings with an air of authority that the deputies found amusing and that Roy regarded with the unflappable parental composure of a man who knows exactly who his son is. Clara, 3 years old, had somehow learned to read. Not haltingly, not letter by letter, but actually read. She would pick up whatever document was available and work through it with a concentration that silenced a room. Doc Haynes, who had by this point become a regular dinner guest on Sunday evenings, said she was the most remarkable child he had encountered in 60 years of observation. Rosa said she got it from her grandmother. Roy said she got it from both of her grandmothers, one of whom he knew and one of whom he felt. He knew well enough from everything he had been told, and Rosa looked at him across the dinner table with the expression that was hers for the moments when he said exactly the right thing. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that tested the northern Panhandle severely. The range dried and the river ran low, and the tempers of ranchers and cattlemen frayed in the familiar pattern of people under pressure. Roy's work expanded in the tense months of July and August, arbitrating disputes, and in 3 cases preventing confrontations that were moving toward violence by the simple application of his presence and his particular quality of authority, which was never raised above what the situation required, and was always precisely sufficient to what it required. Rosa kept school through the summer months, a decision that was initially met with skepticism. Children were needed on ranches in summer, parents argued, and was eventually accepted as valuable because the drought was keeping the work lighter than usual, and the children were better occupied in school than idle, which was the pragmatic argument that won the day over the philosophical one. She was 32 years old that summer and had found, in the years since 24, a version of herself that she was genuinely comfortable with. Not a revised or improved version, but a more fully inhabited version, the same person, just with more room. She knew her own strengths without apology now. She knew her own limits without excessive self-criticism. She knew what she wanted from a day and from a life and from the man she had married, and she knew that what she had was, in the truest accounting, more than she had known to want. On a July evening during the drought summer, when the heat had finally eased at sundown and they were sitting on the porch again with James asleep inside and Clara dozing in Roy's lap with a book still open on the arm of the chair, Rosa said, "I am thinking about what I told you in April of 1878. Roy looked at her. He knew which April she meant. He always knew. "You said you were ordinary," he said. "I was very emphatic about it." "You were," he agreed. "I have been trying," she said slowly, "to understand why that word felt so important to me then, as a shield almost, a way of preempting disappointment. If I named myself ordinary first, no one could name me less than that as a criticism." He was quiet, listening. "I think I used it the way people use modesty when they are afraid," she said. "Not real modesty, the kind that is actually self-protection. And now, he said. Now I know myself well enough that I do not need the shield, she said. I am not afraid of what I am. I know what I am. I am, she paused, searching for the word, capable, specific. Mine. Roy looked at his sleeping daughter in his lap, and then at his wife, and he said, From where I am sitting, you are the most alive person I have ever known, and I have known people in a great many places. She held his gaze across the porch in the evening quiet. You have always seen me too generously, she said, but she said it without her old deflecting certainty. She said it as an affectionate disagreement between two people who know each other well enough to disagree with love. Rosa, he said, I see you exactly as you are. That has always been the whole point. She reached across and took his free hand, his other arm was still around Clara, and held it with the simple, direct sincerity that was how she loved him. I know, she said. That has always been the best thing about you. They stayed on the porch a long time that evening, until the heat was fully gone and the stars were entirely out, and the Canadian River was a sound rather than a sight in the darkness below the town, and the drought-dry land was peaceful in the way that hard country is peaceful when it allows you a moment of rest, and Tascosa went about its quiet nighttime business around them. Roy carried Clara to bed without waking her. James muttered something in his sleep when Roy checked on him that sounded like it might have been about horses. The house settled into its night sounds, the tick of the stove cooling, the window in the bedroom that still rattled in the wind, unchanged from Rosa's first room in the saloon except that this wind was hers, this rattle was her window, this house was her house. She stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment before going to bed, looking out at the garden. The drought had been hard on it, the tomatoes had given up in July and the beans had been determined but limited, but the kitchen herbs had persisted stubbornly, the way practical things often do, and in the moonlight they were silver-gray and quietly present. Her mother, she thought, would have liked this house, would have liked this kitchen, would have liked Roy Rourke, who was as different from Rosa's father as anyone could be, and who was the kind of man who left when he said he would and came back when he said he would and meant everything he said, consistently and without exception. She thought, I thought I was ordinary, and he said he had spent his life looking for ordinary, and we were both right, and neither of us knew what we meant, and now we do. She went to bed. Roy was already there, reading by the low light of the oil lamp, and he looked up when she came in with the expression that was his for her, specifically and only her, that she had been collecting for 6 years and had not yet run out of room for. Everything all right? He asked. Everything is very much all right, she said, and got into bed beside him, and he put the book down and turned out the lamp, and outside the Panhandle wind did what it always did, and the stars continued their vast, steady business above the flat country, and in the house on the edge of Tascosa, everything was, genuinely all right. The school year of 1886 to 1887 was the best one yet. Rosa had 31 students. The expanded schoolroom was full. Alice Pratt had become an accomplished teacher in her own right, and the curriculum Rosa had developed over 5 years had acquired a reputation that extended beyond the Panhandle. A letter came from the state education office in Austin inquiring about her methods, and she spent 3 evenings writing a detailed response that described the approach she had developed, which was essentially, treat children as capable of more than you expect, give them real material to engage with rather than watered-down approximations, and never mistake familiarity with mastery. The education office wrote back expressing interest and requesting a sample of the student's work. She sent it. 2 months later, a letter arrived naming Rosa Rourke as one of 12 exemplary teachers in the state of Texas. Roy framed the letter and put it on the kitchen wall. She told him that was excessive. He said it was not sufficient. They left it on the wall. James started the first grade that autumn at his mother's school, which created its own set of interesting dynamics. He was one of the most advanced students in his year, and one of the least inclined to demonstrate it in the expected way, which Rosa recognized as a personality trait rather than a deficiency, and which Roy said was entirely his fault. James had friends easily. His father's directness softened by his mother's warmth into a combination that was genuinely likable. And he was the informal leader of the older boys contingent on the schoolyard, without being the kind of leader who led through force. The kind that led through making everything seem like it had been a good idea all along. Clara, at 4, was being informally educated in the front of the classroom more days than not. She had progressed from reading to writing in the way of someone following a natural path, and she had strong opinions about the spelling of things that she expressed with a certainty that made Alice Pratt laugh and Rosa wonder where this child had come from, and then remember Roy looking at her across the kitchen table saying, "I see you exactly as you are, and understand." In the spring of 1887, Rosa found herself expecting a third time. She and Roy talked about it at length on a slow Saturday afternoon with the children at Harold's wife's house. Harold had married 3 years prior, a widow from Mobity named Frances who was nothing like anyone expected and exactly what Harold needed, and they talked with the frank, easy intimacy of two people who had learned to discuss the actual things rather than the polite approximations. She was 33. He was 37. The timing was later than it might have been. The house would need another room, which Roy said he could manage with help from 2 of his deputies, who were better carpenters than lawmen. She said she would be tired again and was pre-apologizing for the temper. He said he considered her temper when she was exhausted to be one of her finer qualities, because it meant she was genuinely tired and not performing it, and that he would rather have her real than comfortable. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. Their second son was born in November of 1887, on a day when the first real cold of the year had arrived, and the stove was running, and the house was warm in the particular way of houses that have been made to hold warmth against a hard climate. They named him Thomas Edward Thomas because Roy liked it and it was his grandfather's name, and Edward because Rosa liked it, and it sounded like someone who would be capable of things. They called him Tom. Tom Rourke was, from the beginning, a different proposition than either of his siblings. He was quieter than James and louder than Clara, more prone to observation than action, but capable of sudden decisive movement when something interested him sufficiently. Doc Haynes, now 73 and somewhat slowed but still present and still dry, held Tom at his christening and said he looked like a man with a plan. James, 7 years old, took one look at his new brother and announced that he was going to teach him to ride. Clara, 5, announced that she was going to teach him to read first. Roy told them both that Tom had other ideas on the schedule and would let them know. The room Roy added to the house that winter was built solid against the north wind, which in the Panhandle was the direction that counted. It had a window facing east for the morning light, which Rosa specified, and a proper cedar floor, which Roy specified because cedar was what he had used for the cradle, and it had held up perfectly. The room was finished in February, just in time for Tom's first spring, and the house that had started as 3 rooms was now 5, which was the right size for a family that had grown in the way that good things grow organically, with purpose, in the right season. By 1888, Tascosa had changed considerably from the rough cattle trade town Rosa had arrived in a decade before. It was not domesticated exactly. The Texas Panhandle did not domesticate easily, but it had more to it. A proper church, a school that was the pride of the district. A doctor who had taken on a young partner because Doc Haynes was finally accepting that his 60-year-old body was not going to permit him indefinitely to do the work of a 30-year-old. A general store that had expanded twice. A small newspaper, the Tascosa Pioneer, that published weekly and had once, memorably, run a piece about Rosa's school that she was embarrassed by and Roy kept a copy of. Roy's position as marshal had expanded in its responsibilities, but not in its difficulty. The range wars of the early 1880s had largely settled into the uncomfortable equilibrium of new arrangements that everyone disliked equally but had agreed to live with, and the day-to-day work was more about maintenance and arbitration than about acute crises. He was good at the maintenance and arbitration. He was good at being the steady presence in the background of a community's life, the thing you counted on not because it was dramatic, but because it was reliably, consistently there. He was 40 years old that year, and had the look of a man who has arrived exactly where he belongs. Not settled into softness, he was still the same physically capable, alert, direct person, but settled into rightness. The way a well-made thing settles into its use and becomes more itself with time rather than less. Rosa was 36, and teaching school was the work that had made her most fully herself, and she knew it the way you know a true thing, not because you decided it, but because it is simply evident when you look honestly. She had published an article in a Texas education journal that year about teaching reading to children across different skill levels in a single classroom, and the response had been genuinely gratifying. She had been invited to speak at a state teachers' conference in Austin. She went, leaving Roy with the children for a week, James and Tom, who together managed to turn the kitchen into something that required significant remediation upon her return, and Clara, who apparently managed to prevent even more damage than she had been able to and was thoroughly dignified about it. The conference in Austin was the first time Rosa had been away from Tascosa in years, and she moved through the city with the unsentimental interest of someone observing the changed world from a fixed point of her own. She met other teachers, primarily women, navigating the same work of education in different settings, and she felt for the first time the full dimension of what she was part of, something larger than a schoolroom in a Panhandle town. Something that was about what the next generation would be able to do with their minds. She came home with 2 new ideas for the curriculum and a profound appreciation for her own kitchen. And she stood at the kitchen window on the evening of her return, watching the garden in its late-season state, and felt the particular gratitude of a person who has gone somewhere and come back and found that home has held. Roy was at the stove when she came in, which was not his natural territory, but he had been managing it for a week and had developed a functional relationship with it. James was setting the table with Tom's supervision, which was backwards but apparently working. Clara was reading at the table, which was the same in every configuration of the household. "You are home," Roy said, turning from the stove. "I am home," she said. He looked at her in that way of his assessing direct, carrying something in the look that was warmer than assessment, and said, "The conference went well. Very well." She set her bag down. "I am full of ideas that will take 6 months to implement." "I expected nothing less," he said, and the slight warmth in his voice was satisfaction, specifically the satisfaction of someone who is glad the person they love is doing exactly what they love doing. Tom appeared at her elbow with the solemn urgency of a 1-year-old with news. She picked him up, and he buried his face in her neck with the contentment of a child reestablishing the central fact of his world. James said "Ma" with the casual relief of a 7-year-old who has been managing without his mother, and is glad the management is over. Clara looked up from her book and said, "Welcome home," with the composed dignity of a 5-year-old who has clearly held everything together. Rosa looked around her kitchen, the stove that had been the center of her world since she moved in, the herbs in the window that had survived the drought and everything else, the table around which her family arranged itself, the framed letter from the state education office on the wall, and felt the complete, specific weight of her actual life, which was nothing like what she would have designed for herself at 24, and everything she could possibly have wanted. "I am very glad to be home," she said. Roy crossed the kitchen and kissed her briefly, practically, the way he did when the children were present and were watching them with varying degrees of attention, and then he said quietly against her ear, "I am very glad you are home." She put her free arm around him, Tom still on her hip, and James said from the table, "The beans are going to burn," and Roy said the beans are fine with authority and went to check the beans, which were marginally fine. In the last days of 1888, on a December afternoon when the Panhandle cold had properly settled in, and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the way, it was quiet in the evenings now full of a restful silence that was the specific product of a full day being over. Roy and Rosa sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked about the year that was ending. He said, "If you had told me in 1877 that this was where I would be by 1888, I would not have known how to believe it," she said. "What would you have found hardest to believe?" He thought about it with the honesty he brought to everything. "The staying," he said. "I had moved for so long. I had forgotten what staying felt like." He paused. "Or I had never learned it properly, I am not sure which." She wrapped both hands around her mug in a gesture that was, he knew, her thinking gesture. "I think sometimes about who I was when I came to Tascosa in 1875, she said. "So certain I understood what my life was going to be. The shape of it, small and self-sufficient and enough." She paused. "Enough is a strange thing. I thought I was aiming for enough, and I did not know that enough was so much less than sufficient." "And now," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she had known for 10 years, who had pressed a bandana to her shoulder and told her she was remarkable when she was trying to talk him out of it, who had written twice-weekly letters across the Panhandle and kissed her hand at a river bend, and asked her to marry him in the cold November wind, and built a room for their third child with his own hands, who had always looked at her like she was the specific remarkable thing she had spent years insisting she was not. "Now," she said, "I think I was aiming for the wrong target entirely. I was aiming for management. I did not know you could aim for this." The wave of her hand encompassed the kitchen, the house, the sleeping children down the hall, the garden put to bed outside, the whole specific shape of the life they had built together, ordinary in every individual detail and extraordinary in its sum. Roy Rourke looked at his wife across the kitchen table and said, "I told you in 1878 that I had spent my life looking for ordinary. I want you to know that I have not once regretted finding it." She laughed, the genuine, sudden laugh that had surprised her the first time he produced it and had become, in the years since, one of the reliable joys of her daily life. "You are still not using that word correctly," she said. "Yes, I am," he said, and his eyes were the gray-green of the river in its season, and he meant every word, and she knew it, and she let herself know it fully and without reservation. Outside, the Panhandle wind came off the Canadian River and moved through the darkness over the flat country, the same wind that had rattled windows in the saloon room where she had first lain awake thinking about river-colored eyes, the same wind that had been blowing since before either of them existed and would continue long after, indifferent to the particular human warmth held in this specific house on the edge of this specific town. But inside the house it was warm. Inside the house there was coffee and lamplight and two people who had found each other across the wide, difficult country and had chosen, specifically and deliberately, to stay. 3 children asleep down the hall, growing into their own specific shapes, inheriting their father's steadiness and their mother's precision and something that was entirely their own. Tom would grow into a reader like his sister, quiet and thorough and full of considered opinions. Clara would grow into a teacher like her mother, with her father's directness and her mother's patience in equal measure. James would grow into a rancher, eventually, on land he purchased south of Tascosa, and he would ride the way Roy had taught him and keep accounts the way Rosa had taught him, and he would be good and decent and capable in the manner of a person raised to believe those qualities were worth having. But all of that was still ahead, stored in the years yet to arrive. In December of 1888, there was only the kitchen and the coffee and the lamplight and 2 people who knew each other completely and were not afraid of what they knew. "Roy," she said. "Rosa," he said. She reached across the table and he met her halfway, the way they always did, and she held his hand across the kitchen table in the warm house on the edge of Tascosa under the enormous Texas sky. And there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing that needed to be said that had not been said, nothing that needed to be done that had not been done, nothing that was wanted that was not, in this moment and in the shape of this life already, entirely here. The Panhandle wind moved through the dark outside, and the Canadian River ran cold and low in its winter banks, and the stars above the flat country were the same stars they had watched from the porch in every season, vast and steady and endlessly present. And in the house that was theirs, in the life that was theirs, Rosa Chandler Rourke and Roy Rourke sat in the lamplight and were, fully and completely, home.